Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Philip Bump, the author of The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom, and the Future of Power in America. This is his first book. He's a national correspondent for the Washington Post, where he focuses on the data behind politics. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Bump.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Suddenly, America is not growing. For the first time since George Washington was president, population growth was nearly flat last year, just 0.1%. Philip Bump writes that if another baby boom generation started right now, America would effectively break. We would have to have twice as many schools, public services, and infrastructure to handle the influx of people. He also argues that the boomers weren't just part of America, they became America. Their needs, wants, politics, and cultural dictates were all encompassing. So my first question, Philip, if a new generation of that size would break America today, why didn't it break America back then?
It did, actually.
Well, there you go. What a question.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Thanks for
What a
coming.
question.
No, I mean, it essentially what happened. So we have, there's about 140 million people in America in 1945. And over the course of the next 19 years, more than 75 million kids were born, right? And that's just, it's staggering to think about. It means, the equivalent today would be having, 165,000 children born, north of that even, over the course of the next 20 years. And that's, did I say thousand?
Million.
Not
Right.
65 million. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Right. Just an enormous number of kids. And, you think about what that means. To the point you raised earlier, you'd have to build new schools. You'd have to accommodate them. You'd build a massive new marketplace for babies, right? And this is exactly what happened at the onset of the baby boom. All of a sudden, you have all these companies that cater to babies that are seeing this bonanza, this huge new marketplace that has emerged and lasted for several decades. Then, of course, you see the same thing happen where you have to build all these schools. You have these kids then eventually become teenagers, and it's this huge group of consumers that really start to drive what consumerism looks like in the United States. And so it really did. I mean, when we say break, obviously you can break things in all sorts of different ways, but it really did force America to reckon with this massive population of people in a way that it's very fair to characterize as breaking it. It forced America to change how it did any number of things, where it put money, how it invested, how it did politics, all these things. As the boom continued to age, it continued to break different things and eventually just reshaped America entirely.
What was the biggest change in terms of public policy that had to be made to handle all of these new people?
Well, I think education was really a signal moment because at the outset, you have to build new kindergartens, right? That's not that complicated, and you have to hire new kindergarten teachers and so on and so forth. But as kids get older, you start to have to do more of these things in more complicated ways, right? You have to have, once you get to high school, you have to have teachers who are trained in how to actually educate high schoolers, right? And that's different. I don't mean that my kids in kindergarten. I don't mean disparage kindergarten teachers, but it's a very different ball game. Then you get to college, right? And all of a sudden, you have all these young people who are graduating from high school, and they have to go somewhere. Are they going to go into the workforce? There's only so many jobs in the workforce. Are they going to go to college? There's only so many colleges, and professors, even harder still to get geared up. We end up sending a lot of those teenagers to Vietnam. Is it a coincidence that the baby boom came on the scene and became of military age right when Vietnam was gearing up? No, not at all, right? There's overlap there. And but education is such a good example because it is something that had to be changed in order to accommodate this population from top to bottom. This county of Los Angeles, the factoid I like to point out, county of Los Angeles is averaging one new school every single month over the course of the baby boom from elementary to middle to high school. and that's one count. It's insane. I mean, the scale of this thing, and it forced everything to change.
Imagine if you tried to open up a new school every month, and even
Right.
the smallest school district in America, it'd be impossible. The oldest baby boomers right now, if you consider the baby boom in the beginning of 1946, the oldest ones are about 80 years old, 77, 78 years old. That is beyond the average life expectancy in the United States. So unfortunately, of course, they're going to start dying off in greater and greater numbers. Why did you decide that now was a good time to take stock of what they have meant for our country and what could be coming next?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, the one reason, obviously, is that there isn't going to be a hard and fast point at which the baby boom ends. Happily, it's not going to be the case that baby boomers are all, dying in the next 5 years. Luckily, baby boomers will be around for decades. My parents are baby boomers. I'd like them to stick around, right?
Mine too.
Yeah,
include them
that
in
aspect
that
of it,
yeah.
Right? Absolutely, yeah. So both of our parents. Everyone else we're not that worried about, but our parents definitely. But the other aspect of it is that we really are at this moment where the baby boomers are starting to lose their grip on power, and that's what really triggered it. This realization that the baby boomers, who'd been accommodated their entire lives by American society and culture and government, had been having their needs tended to primarily. All of a sudden, they are facing competition from a younger generation, the millennials, and even younger still, Gen Z, which is, combined, millennials and Gen Z are larger than the baby boom was in terms of sheer numbers. Of course, the population in the United States was smaller, so the baby boom was a greater percentage of the population. But this is a large group of people that is now competing for resources. And this isn't just an abstraction, right? Now, remember, we talked about how the baby boom as it aged was forcing things to break. Well, we finally gotten to the point where the baby boom has retired and is now entering senior care and, extended long-term medical care and things along those lines. And those systems now have to accommodate the baby boom. The government now has to start, in the way that it had to build kindergartens in 1950, now it has to start building senior housing. But at the same time, you have this younger generation of people, and they have different needs. They need schools themselves. They need education funding. They need childcare, and they have a lot of votes. They may not vote as heavily as boomers, but they have a lot of votes. And so you see this tension playing out between these two large groups of people that really is forcing a reckoning around the power of the baby boom, which I think makes this book important at the moment.
Is it possible to put a baby boomer into a box and say, this is about when they were born. This is about where they were born. This is about what their politics are and about what kinds of families and occupations they've had?
Yeah, it's easier to talk about baby boomers in contrast to younger Americans for a few reasons. The first is that the baby boom itself is so disparate, right? You have, the baby boom is viewed as sort of heavily conservative, which isn't entirely fair. I mean, the baby boom is, almost evenly split Democrat, Republican. It's just that because the Democratic Party skews so much younger, that older white Americans make up a much bigger percentage of the Republican Party. And so they're sort of more associated with it. But instead of looking at, sort of the average boomer, it's more useful, I think, to compare it to, what boomers are collectively to what millennials are collectively, because the contrasts are greater. So, for example, the baby boom is much whiter than younger generations, in part because immigration was being restricted during the period when the boom actually occurred. Younger people today are much more likely to be the child of an immigrant or immigrants themselves than were baby boomers. They're much less likely to be white. They're more likely to be Black or Asian or particularly Hispanic. There was this trend that began actually with the baby boomers of moving away from institutions, that they were less likely to participate in religion, things along those lines. That trend has continued very much with younger generations, and younger generations today are much less likely to participate in institutions, including political parties, church attendance. But at the same time, they're also better educated. So this trend that the boomers started of going to school more, going to college more, that also continued. And so you have younger people are much better educated than older people. So there are these various differences between young and old. Older Americans literally were everyone in America, right? So, sort of categorizing them beyond anything beyond American is sort of difficult. But there's a sharp contrast with younger people.
This is sort of an aside question, but how much did you study the baby boom squared, like the children of the baby boom? How important is that to your book?
Yeah, what's wild about the baby boom is that we tend to think of generations in very stark and sharp terms that isn't accurate, right? I mean, there were baby boomers that gave birth to baby boomers, right? You're born in 1946 and you're having a kid at 18, then all of a sudden your kid's a baby boomer too, right? Like, but at the same time, you also have baby boomers, right? Mick Jagger had a kid, right? Like, that guy's silent generation, he's still having kids, right? So, it is not really hard and fast along, when we think about it this way. it is very clear that people find it useful to think about generations as collective groups. And it is also clear that there are certain differentiators that set apart groups like the millennials from the baby boom. It is the case, however, the Census Bureau only recognizes one generation as demographically unique and identifiable. That's the baby boom, simply by virtue of the number of the kids that were born. So, it is useful for us to think about this in terms of generational conflict, older and younger, in part because we're all familiar with, our own interpersonal, interfamilial generational tensions. But it is not quite so clear cut as boomers had Gen X, who had millennials, who had Gen Z. It didn't work that way.
It just hit me that Donald Trump is like born the first year of the baby boom, 1946, and his kid is way younger than me, at least one of the 5 kids.
Yeah, he's a millennial, Baron, sure.
Why, it's easy to put the baby boomers into this box, like this little explanation of like why it happened. People came back from World War II and they had families. Is the story that clear cut? Why did the baby boom happen?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not, if you think about it for a second, right? Like you no matter how constrained you felt by World War II, you weren't having kids for 19 years once that constraint was relaxed. There's no, it's like talking about the death of the baby boomers. There's no nice way to talk about, horny soldiers. But anyway, the point being that
was a pretty nice way to talk about them. Yeah, that wasn't so. That wasn't unnice.
Yeah. At the end, right? There were a few reasons to it. And honestly, the book doesn't get into them because it's been, better written elsewhere. But essentially, we had this period of global challenges, but also national challenges that lasted several decades up until the baby boom, from the Great Depression to, World War I and back before that, but World War II in particular. Then you have in the aftermath of World War II, this massive surge, huge economic boom, huge surge in national confidence, which, obviously is sort of vaguely articulated, but it's certainly something that was felt. And you had these various factors of people sort of holding off on having kids, not sure about it, and then all of a sudden just being enthusiastic, let's just go ahead and have kids and let's, then it also sort of builds on itself. Like everyone's having kids, this is the big thing. Life magazine, I've got the original Life magazine here, like just celebrating all these kids that are being born. And it's just sort of, it became a cultural phenomenon to some extent as well. Again, lasts for 19 years, which is not simply a function of people deciding they're going to have a kid and be done with it.
It was interesting to me because I looked at the chart myself, and this is a rudimentary chart. I mean, this is like Wikipedia stuff, but the birth rates were already going up significantly even before the baby boom officially starts.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, so there had been some concern in the early 1940s in particular that the United States was going to see some stagnation. And there's a report that I cite in the book from the late 1930s that talks about that, talks about the government's concern. Look, we don't want to go down the path of some of these European countries where they're seeing, their younger population decline. There actually was a boom before the boom, and they started talking about a baby boom even in 1945, just based on the increase in births that had happened over the course of World War II, which also sort of undercuts the narrative about the soldiers. Obviously, there were some soldiers coming back, but so there was this little blip, this little boom prior to the giant boom. And so I think that even at the time, people were like, oh, okay, good. This trend's turning around, and little did they know.
My favorite thing about the whole book is that you interviewed the first baby boomer, and you kind of tease that, but then you get there at the end, and I was like, oh, cool. He actually found her. That's a great way to do reporting. Her name is Kathleen Casely Kirschling. What's she like, by the way? Is she like what we would think the typical baby boomer is?
No, I don't think so, man. She's fascinating for a lot of reasons. The first is that she really is very here's the thing that struck me about her. So I reached out to her because she was born just at the stroke of midnight, January 1st, 1946. And so according to the Census Bureau, the baby boom really started in about the middle of 1946. But it's hard to find, the first person born on a vague random date. And so in 1980, a guy, Landon Jones, who at the time was working for, I believe, Forbes magazines, one of those money magazines, he was writing a book about the baby boom. And so he actually tracked Kathleen Casey Kirschling down and identified her as the first baby boomer and sort of just canonically made her, just declared her, she's the first boomer. And what's fascinating is when you read his book, Great Expectations, which came out in 1980, he sort of just talks about her in the abstract as, here's this person. But then over the years, he kept going back to her and interviewing her.
So she would have been 34 when he first talked to her.
Yes, but she didn't know about it until... No, that's a good point, actually, because I think the book came out in 1980, but she says she didn't start talking to him until she was 40. Maybe she said almost 40.
So, okay,
but she was around 40, according to her. It doesn't matter. No, it's fine. No, it's important to get these accurate, so I want to make sure I'm getting it right. But anyway, it's very clear she's extremely self-aware of being the first baby boomer by now, right? And she's been interviewed lots of times as the first baby boomer. So when you talk to her, you're talking to her as this person, this individual who went through this thing, but also as someone who's very cognizant of that position. And it's hard not to see in her responses, and I don't mean this in any way pejoratively, but that she's just aware of being a reflection of the boom. And so when she talks about herself, she often contextualizes it in what the boom broadly is doing. Right. Which is just sort of a fascinating way to live your life. But yeah, she's a perfectly charming woman. She is very cognizant of the ways in which boomers were advantaged and younger people aren't. And she was very wonderful and helpful. And I'm grateful to her.
Was she at all hesitant to talk to you, or she's just so used to being hit up that she's like, yeah, whatever, let's just do it?
Yeah, no, I reached out to a couple of people, actually, when I was starting in the book, including a person who I'd found who wasn't Landon Jones's book, who I had found through old newspaper clippings, was born right at the stroke of midnight. So I sent letters because I didn't have email addresses necessarily, and B, because I thought they'd might be more likely picked up. And she responded just like right off, instantly, and was like, hey, cool. Let's talk. And so we started on from there.
Nice. What were your sources for this? I'm always curious. I always ask this question. Is it just the data? Were you just pouring through charts? How many on the ground interviews did you do? How many books did you consult? Newspapers, magazines? Just explain your process in creating this portrait.
Yeah. I mean, I talked to probably 100 people, from college professors to a guy who runs a cemetery in Brooklyn to a guy who, studies how long human beings live to, you name it, countless books, a lot of research papers, a lot of college professors and research papers that were very helpful in sort of understanding, one of the core themes of the book is what happens to American demography and does it match what the Census Bureau expects, because that drives a lot of our politics in the moment. And so there's a lot of research around race, talking to economists about housing, economy, economics is not my forte. So I, spoke to a lot of people for whom it is. My favorite thing that I dug up was I wanted to tell the story of how people broadly are bad at predicting the future. And I stumbled onto this story about a time capsule that's to this day sits in Birmingham City Hall. And it was created in 1950 when Birmingham was turning 100 and it's supposed to be opened in 2050. And so I was reading about it and reading, the predictions. They had all these leaders write letters to be put in this time capsule. And I was reading about them and I came across this one from the police chief in Birmingham. And you've read the book, so you know where the story is going. But, and it was just like, I think in 2050, we'll have to have international police because people will be flying all over and blah, blah, blah. And it was Bull Connor, right, who, within a decade was infamous for his horrible abusive behavior toward Black Americans. And it's just a reminder of, as I'm sitting here writing this book, looking forward to 2060, which is when the Census Bureau ends its demographic projections, and thinking about what America's going to look like, there's a humility and understanding of that, back in 1950, Bull Connor thought everything was going to be peaches and roses forever. And the only thing you need to worry about was international flights to catch criminals, because he just always lacked that self-awareness. And so, that was my favorite thing I did. I actually contacted the library in Birmingham. They sent me a copy of the letter, and it's, it's sort of fascinating just to be able to see this thing that, isn't going to be seen by anyone else until 2050.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. The sequence, I'm a big presidential history guy. So the sequence of birth dates of American presidents is really weird. For much of history, or maybe it's not so weird, there's a clear relationship between the years presidents were born and when they took office. But when you get to Clinton, the increases stop. He and George W. Bush are both born in 1946. So that now represents 16 years of a baby boomer at the helm. Then Obama, you kind of jump ahead. Okay, he's not necessarily a baby boomer, though some might say he was. He's sort of an anomaly. But then we go back to 1946 again with Donald Trump. We had 3 presidents born in the same year, and they took office. They held office from 1992 to 2020. So what does that pause? What does that kind of that time period say about the enduring political power of baby boomers?
Yeah, I mean, just to correct the record, Barack Obama is a baby boomer.
Yeah, I mean,
is,
15 years does seem like a long time, though. But yeah,
I mean, people, when you say there are 4 baby boomer presidents, people assume it's Biden, but Biden's actually silent.
He's pre.
I mean,
he's pre baby boomer.
I mean, not only were Trump and Bush and Clinton all born in 46, they were born in 2 months of each other. Like it went June, July, August. It's insane.
Yeah.
And I think the lesson that you take away from that is twofold. First, that they represent the 3 major strains of politics in America today, right? There's probably a 4th strain, which is, the very progressive left. But you have Bill Clinton as the moderate Democrat. He gets elected first. You have George W. Bush as the establishment Republican. He gets reelected next. And then you have Trump as the, hard right Republican. And so you can see how the baby boom, even just in that same year, encapsulates those 3 political ideologies. But then you think about the fact that they came in that order, and you see also a progression of how the boom was voting, right? So you have this fairly liberal population of people voting for Clinton. They become a little bit more conservative with George W. Bush. They become much more conservative and vote for Trump. And you see that progression through time as well. And that's the way in which I think those 3 bursts in a row are representative.
What does it say about, I mean, when you look at the power that they exude over the presidency and then in Congress, I mean, when I was reading it in your book, there are so many members of Congress that represent this generation. And maybe unlike other generations, they just haven't seemed to gone away at all.
Yeah, they're starting to go away. And, I don't mean to sound nasty when I say that, but it's true. And if you look at the average age of Congress over time, when boomers start to get of Congress age, shortly thereafter, you see the shift in the average age of Congress. The average age of Congress is shift down to about where boomers are. And then it just stays, a 1-to-1 match, you add a year every year. But in the most recent election cycles, it's actually started to dip down again. And we had this really important moment that didn't make the book because the book was finished before this happened. But you had this moment where the Democratic leadership this year, in part because they lost the majority, certainly, but even beyond that, all the senior leaders of the Democratic Party, who were all older, boomer or older, stepped down and made way for a new generation of leaders. And I think that's representative both of the recognition by them that they had sort of reached the end of their need for power to some extent, but also that the Democratic Party, which is very heavily made up of young people, needed to demonstrate to younger generation of people that this was their time. And we even heard this back in 2020 with Joe Biden pledging, he's going to be a bridge to a younger generation. He said that because he recognized this as something the Democrats wanted to hear. But now we're actually seeing that being affected, but only on the Democratic side, because the Democrats are the ones that need to be responsive to these younger voters.
How did technology impact this generation? It's so interesting to me, the word boom, right? It suggests that they had a really big microphone. How does the rise of the baby boomers match the rise of technology and these enormous microphones that we all now have?
Yeah, so there were a lot of technological developments which had an important role, particularly in the cultural world around baby boomers. Television, the rise of television ads, transistor radios and radios in cars that helped define what boomer culture looked like for teenage boomers. And over time we get the emergence of things like social media, but I think those are generally recognized, and polling supports the idea that baby boomer aged people have been less likely to take up those tools. I think it's important to note, though, and I try and note this in interviews like this, that one of the things, the baby boom was very vocal, and it was vocal through scale, right? So, the reason that the voting age shifted from 21 to 18 wasn't simply that people were objecting to Vietnam War. It was that you had an absolute massive number of 18-year-olds who were advocating and agitating for the right to vote. And that helped, force the scale. But on an individual basis today, individual young people can be heard in a way that simply wasn't possible back then. There were always gatekeepers. that need to be get through for the baby boom. That's not the case anymore. Now you have young people that can become viral sensations overnight, and they can do things like challenge the older generation with like songs like "Okay Boomer" and frustrate the older people and be present in older people's lives in a way that wasn't possible when they were young, which I think itself exacerbates some generational tensions.
And how does that generational tension manifest itself in our culture and in our politics?
Oh, I mean,
how
scores
doesn't
of
it?
ways,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Right,
no,
right.
literally, how doesn't it, right? I mean, let's look at housing. Housing is my favorite example here because it's so clear cut and everyone can understand it. There's a lot of tension between younger people and older people around housing. And it is the case that older people are much, much, much more likely to own houses than younger people for a lot of reasons, including that houses are very expensive. But why are houses expensive, right? It is not the case that baby boomers collectively got together and said, let's keep houses expensive. It was instead the fact that baby boom is a massive generation, many of whom own houses and many of whom see those houses as storehouses of value for their retirement. So if you are looking forward to retirement and you're in your 60s and 70s and your house is that value, you're going to want to preserve the value of that house. And so when there's a community meeting, should we build this apartment building down the block? You show up and you say, no, we should not do that. The effect of that then is to tamp down on the number of affordable homes that are available in your area or new houses in general. And that has a trickle-down effect on younger generations who don't have houses to move into. Eventually, this is going to shake out a little bit, right? Both because now there's much more awareness of this issue and more houses being built, but also because, older people are going to die or they're going to sell those houses to reap that value that they see in them. And those houses become available for purchase. But at this moment, that is a way in which individual boomers are making decisions about protecting their own long-term financial security, and collectively, because the boom is such a massively huge generation, that has this crippling effect on the housing market that is disadvantaging a lot of younger people.
How did the experiences of white baby boomers and black baby boomers compare and contrast?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the case that Black Americans broadly have been historically disadvantaged. I mean, I don't need to tell you this. And there was the boom emerged in this moment immediately in the wake of the civil rights movement. There's some boomer involvement in the civil rights movement, not a whole lot. They were pretty young at that point in time. And so there was this sort of new paradigm for race that emerged. And one of the things that I think people forget is, remember, we talked about how immigration was restricted when the boom began. It wasn't lifted until the late 1960s, at which point you started to see more immigrants from Asia and Mexico and Central America, and meaning more Asian and Hispanic immigrants coming to the United States. And so at the time when the boom started, really in the 1970s and 1980s, when we're talking about racial tension, we're talking about white and black. There just weren't that many Hispanic people and Asian people. It was predominantly, when we're talking about racial tension, we're talking about black and white. And one of the things that's been fascinating over the course of the baby boom is, well, there's a couple of things. One is that the baby boom itself has gotten less white because immigrants from other countries who were born in this period and therefore technically are categorized as baby boomers have helped to make the baby boom particularly more Hispanic than it was actually at the outset. The baby boom continued to grow until the year 2000, which is sort of surprising given that it ended 1964, but immigration works as magic. But then you also have this reshaping of what racial tension looks like in the United States. So it's always been clear that there is racial tension between white and black, and there are disadvantages that black people face, in part, obviously, through societal repression based on skin color. But now you have this large population of Americans who don't fit into that white or black grouping. And so part of what the book also does is looks at how demographers and how social scientists view the emerging racial scale in the United States. What are the racial boundaries going to look like in the future as America becomes less centrally white and black, and you have these people who are Asian and Hispanic and all these other groups? And to what extent are we under recognizing that we already have this broad scale of racial identifications in the United States? And this, I talk in the book about how the Census Bureau changed the way it collects data. Between 2010 and 2020, there's a huge surge in people who identified as white, some other race. And the reason why is because the Census Bureau allowed people to be more descriptive in how they identified themselves. And so there are a lot of people who identify as white. And if you looked at them, you'd think, oh, that person's white. Really, when they're asked, they say, well, I'm white and, I'm part Puerto Rican and, whatever it happens to be. It's just that no one really asks that question except the government. And so the government collects this data and it forces people to sort of decide which box they're in. And it used to be the case that they had these very tightly constricted boxes. And now they sort of open those boxes up a little bit and given us a better sense of the diversity of the United States, which already recolors the way that we look at race in the United States. So your question is very specific about white versus black, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But this is it's a topic which I find personally fascinating. So I went on a little bit of a tangent, but it really is the case that what race means in the United States is changing in a way that's alarming a lot of, traditionally white Americans, which overlaps with politics.
Well, then let me ask about Barack Obama, because you say that his election signaled a sea change in their approach to politics. So what have you been able to glean from the data about the baby boomers' attitudes towards politics, and how did it change the moment Barack Obama, a late year baby boomer, became president?
So the Obama presidency is fascinating in part because it was, as you say, obviously someone who was not explicitly white who was being elected as president. And so for people who were driven by fears of race-based fears, if you will, that was something that was alarming to them. It is also the case that around that same period of time, there were new reports about how the Census Bureau was projecting that whites were going to be a minority in the United States for the course of the next X number of decades. And those numbers have changed when it's actually going to happen. But that was something that triggered a lot of people to be like, oh my God, the racial apocalypse is upon us, right? The one of the most important factors, though, when you talk to people who studied the Tea Party, which obviously emerged as a response primarily to Barack Obama, one of the things that you learn is that a lot of the people who participated in the Tea Party were older Americans, boomers or older, who were concerned because they saw their young grandchildren or children, mostly grandchildren, who were very much taken with Barack Obama, thought he was great and liked his politics, liked what he stood for. And when you talk about the age gap in presidential voting, it really yawns wide open in 2008. In 2004, there's a pretty big gap, in part because young people hated George W. Bush. But in 2008, it becomes this huge chasm. And so you have this older population, many of whom are being told by Fox News and other sources that Barack Obama is a socialist, and who've just come out of the Cold War, relatively speaking, right? And they see Barack Obama as this strange thing, a representation of how America is changing away from them, a new style of politics that is explicitly progressive in a way that Bill Clinton wasn't, coming from a person who's not white, and appealing to all these young people. And so there's this fear that America is changing, getting away from them, that's really triggered at that moment by Barack Obama's election, and obviously continues to resonate today.
What is going to become, there's a huge debate going on right now, and I guess there always is, about what is going to happen to Medicare and Social Security. Sure. What is going to become of these programs that baby boomers have relied on, and that their kids, myself being one of them, would be interested in availing themselves of when the time is right? Is there the same sentimental relationship that my generation has with those programs, and how equipped is the government to adjusting these programs and keeping them going for people of my generation to have? And I guess, is that sentimentality towards them shared by my generation in the way that the baby boomers look at those programs?
I would say it's probably not the case that younger people today are terribly aware of the programs, in the way that people are not necessarily particularly familiar with programs that they themselves don't use. I haven't seen any polling on that, so I can't say that with certitude. But these programs are fascinating, particularly Social Security, because they are designed to have people pay into them as they work and then draw down from once they retire. And so one of the things that we're seeing as we talk about the drawdown of Social Security funds, which that's triggering a lot of alarm, is that this is a sort of a natural extension of baby boomers retiring. There's a huge surge in people working. They've contributed a lot of money to these funds, and now they're starting to draw them down. And so when you speak with experts, some of them will be sort of, I don't want to say blasé, but not particularly concerned about it, because this is the way the system is supposed to work. There are a lot of questions, though, right? One question, for example, is how long are baby boomers going to live? If you're guaranteed Social Security, but people are living far longer than they used to, or if you're retiring early, and at this point in time, most retirees are baby boomers. If you are going to live for another 30 years, that obviously draws down on those resources in a way that may not have been anticipated based on actuarial tables at the time. So it is certainly the case that the system is designed to be inflated with a lot of people working, then drawn down on as a lot of people retire. It's just not clear that we found the right balance of how much is going to be given out. And, if people have made these determinations about how much they need to retire on, those may need to shift. They may not get as much money as they're expecting, which obviously creates new strains and stressors. Will the program still be around by the time you and I get to retirement age? I feel pretty confident saying yes, in part because there is, it was largely the Republican Party which was incentivized to attack these programs as, they talked about cutting government spending. But now their base is very heavily either at retirement age or nearing retirement age, and much less interested in talking about cutting, programs which they themselves are currently availing themselves of or about to. And so, we see even Kevin McCarthy at this point in time, who there's been some Republicans floating it. Yeah, he's just saying it's not going to happen, and it's pretty obvious why.
This is a total aside question, and you may not know the answer. Could Social Security be saved or greatly extended by eliminating the tax cap?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Fair enough. There was a debate.
I mean, look. Yeah. As I said, I spoke with a lot of smart experts in the book, and I relied on what they told me, and I'm afraid to say that didn't come up.
Fair enough. A couple of years ago, there was a debate, maybe not much of a debate. Someone said, "Okay, boomer is the new N-word." Obviously, it is not, and I'm not ever suggesting it is. But what does that say about the sensitivity that boomers themselves have?
My first response is that famous John Mulaney joke about how how it's not the N-word is because you're saying "okay, boomer" and you're not saying the N-word, right? Again, when we talk about "okay, boomer" in particular, it was people don't understand that this was largely downstream from the technology that powered its emergence. So it emerged on TikTok, and TikTok is designed to make it easy to do video responses to people, right? So someone posts a video, here's me, I'm shoveling my driveway, and someone can stitch that together with their own video of them doing something. And so what started to happen is boomers, there's this phenomenon in technology when you get a bunch of new people who are using it, and then they come on board and they don't understand the norms and they act like idiots until they understand how technology, the norms of a particular platform. And this happened at the outset of the internet. It happens with new technologies. So basically what happened is boomers started to come to TikTok, and they were doing they were doing the sort of new guy stumbling around and breaking norms and irritating everyone. And young people started thinking it was funny to take this really terrible song. I mean, it's semi-catchy, I guess, but it's just like aggressively noisy in a way that's intended to be kind of annoying. And so they just would stitch themselves, doing things to this song onto these other videos of the boomers. So the boomers then, to the point I raised earlier, they were forced to see these people like basically making fun of them and, casting them as boomers. And it was intentionally frustrating. It was meant to be trolling. The classic New York Times article by my colleague Taylor Lawrence that first articulated this quoted a kid who's saying, like, look, if I'm making them mad, it's working, right? It was an effort to troll a community that wasn't used to being trolled, particularly by younger people. And so, I don't think it's surprising at all that a lot of people got frustrated.
Why is it important for journalists to have backgrounds in data the way you do?
I think that it is important for journalists to have a perspective that they can bring to something that is unique. I don't, it doesn't have to be data necessarily. It happens to be data in my case. I do think journalists could do a better job at understanding data, parsing data, and presenting data, because I think data is a very good way of telling a complicated story fairly easily. The book itself, has well over 100 charts, in part because I like to do charts, but also in part because I think it allows me to say a picture says 1,000 words, right? It says it cut several thousand words on the book, but I think that Americans need to be better generally at understanding data and data presentations. I have a newsletter called How to Read This Chart, which is sort of aimed at that. And I think journalists certainly need to. And I think it would make journalists' jobs easier if they were better at presenting data to people. But, I think you can be a very good journalist and have no idea how to do that, like Bob Woodward.
Thank God.
Sure doesn't know how to make a chart.
Because, my goodness, I try when I need it. Your list of columns includes, I looked at the list of them on the Washington Post website, Chinese balloons, Boris Johnson, George Santos, voter fraud. Do you have carte blanche? How do you pick what you write about?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I have an editor who every morning I pitch several stories that I think might be interesting over the course of the day.
And what department are you in, by the way? when you pitch the editor?
It's technically the national desk.
National desk. Yeah.
So,
Okay, go ahead.
Which includes politics underneath it. So yeah, I mean, it's just sort of what strikes my fancy, and tend to be data related. So pull stuff, or I mean, the balloon thing, for example, that you mentioned is how to make your own spy balloon, which is just sort of a fun way to sort of get into that.
Take
sort of
notes,
George Santos thing was I went and looked at George Santos's FBC records. It tends to be like database stuff or stuff that's just a little outside the box, and it's a lane that I have pretty much to myself, I think, at the Post anyway.
Yeah. Is there a big difference between book writing and column writing?
Oh man, is there? Yeah, I mean, it's like the book was done in the middle of last year, and then I just had to wait for it to come out. Like the midterms were nerve-wracking because it was like, oh my god, what if there's some huge paradigm shift in American politics? Happily, that wasn't the case. But yeah, it's enormously different. Just I mean, I write 3,000 words a day probably for the Post, and the book is 130,000. It just took a lot longer because it's not just it's not just a column of 800 words. It is instead a through line of, at least 20,000 words for a chapter that has a start and a finish. And it's just a totally different task. And it was a new muscle I had to learn.
Did you like it?
I didn't love it. I'll be honest. It was hard. It's hard, man.
No, I can't imagine.
Yeah.
What generation needs a similar book?
There will definitely eventually be a book like this about millennials. I think it's safe to say. I'm sort of noodling about Gen X. I am a member of Gen X, and I think it's sort of fascinating the way in which Gen X has a presence in American culture, particularly in this moment, right? We're starting to see, like, my sister, who's also Gen X, sent me an ad that's going to be at the Super Bowl based on the movie Clueless, which we loved when we were in high school. But it's like a very specific targeting to Gen X, right? The Super Bowl halftime show last year with all those hip hop acts are the hot in the early 90s. Like, that's our generation. We're finally getting our moment. That's going to pass very quickly. And so, I do think it would be fascinating to look at how Gen X represents this sort of lull in population growth. But still has, in sort of being tugged in both ways by these other larger generations. But, is the market there for people wanting to read about Gen X? I don't know.
Finally, a good reporter never gives their pitches away. But the good news is this won't come out for at least a week, if not 2 weeks. So my question is, what are you pitching tomorrow morning at the Washington Post? It's a question I hate to get as a reporter, but do you know yet what you're going to pitch, or do you just like throw it together first thing in the morning?
No, I mean, I try and be responsive to what's going on in the news. I'm looking, I actually have up on my laptop here. One thing I've been meaning to write about for a while is actually a database story, which is looking at this idea. Republicans have this idea that educational systems drive people to the left. And I want to analyze that and look at the data and see the extent to which that is or isn't true. My book research suggests that it's not, but I haven't looked at that closely, and I hope to do so shortly.
If I was your editor, I'd say, go ahead and write it.
Excellent.
Philip Bump, the author of The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom and the Future of Power in America. Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his website, pbump.com. He's on Twitter at pbump. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.